Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, The Future of the Executive State. Please welcome Giancarlo Canaparo, Senior Legal Fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Mies Center for Legal and Judicial Studies.
Three words with potentially seismic import: Chevron is overruled. Chevron deference, as it became to be known, was something of a capstone to an already long-running project to move the lawmaking and policymaking powers from Congress to the administrative state, largely under the control of the president. This rearrangement of powers has attracted criticism over the years. Why has it attracted criticism? What are its implications for our system of government and for our politics? What are its risks and, if any, its benefits? Can it be reversed? If so, how? And what would reform look like? We have an exceptional panel today to parse these questions. They have instructed me to keep their introductions short, much shorter than I think they deserve, but I will obey. So if my panelists would please join me on the stage, and I'll give you your introductions. My immediate right is Paul Ray, the director of the Thomas Rowe Institute here at the Heritage Foundation. Among other positions, Paul served as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, which is commonly called the Regulation Czar. He's a graduate of Harvard Law, Hillsdale College, and a former clerk to Justice Alito and to Judge Deborah Ann Livingston. To his right, Professor Jen Mascott, associate professor at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law, and director of that school's Separation of Powers Institute. Among other positions, she has been Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel. She's a graduate of George Washington Law and a former clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas and then Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Next to Professor Mascott is Chris DeMuth, a distinguished fellow in American thought at the Kenneth B. Simon Center here at the Heritage Foundation. Chronicling Chris's service and achievements would keep me busy for a very long time, so I shall say only that he, in addition to being also the administrator of OIRA, he has served in many positions in multiple presidential administrations, think tanks, and in academia, has thought deeply and written widely about administration. And last on the right is Steve Bradbury, also a distinguished fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. Steve served as the General Counsel and Acting Secretary at the Department of Transportation. He, too, has served in the Office of Legal Counsel, heading that office from 2005 to 2009, and was also a clerk to Justice Thomas and a clerk to Judge James Buckley. So what I will do today is open the panel invite each of our panelists to give remarks on the topic, and then I'll facilitate a discussion between them. So, Chris, if you wouldn't mind taking us away.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Over the past 50 years, many of the legislative powers assigned to Congress by the Constitution have been delegated to or simply assumed by the executive branch. Here's a short list of the things that the executive branch now makes law on every day of the week. Appliances, automobiles, motor vehicles, fuels, the internet, housing, mortgages, credit cards, medical care and insurance, production and distribution throughout the manufacturing, energy, medical, financial, transportation, and retail sectors, employer-employee relations in all but the smallest of businesses, numerous decisions affecting African Americans and other minorities, and many sometimes intimate aspects of relations between women and men. The growth of unilateral executive government on all of these matters has been the subject of vigorous argument going back almost as long as the phenomenon in law reviews and books and judicial opinions. In general, conservatives see it as a dangerous weakening of the Constitution's separation of powers and guarantees of due process of law, while progressives see it as a healthy evolution from clumsy, populist, slow-moving legislation to flexible, expert, high-volume administration. These arguments are of very great importance, but in my view, they have been eclipsed by the sheer scope and dynamism of executive government, which has transformed not just the structure of our government, but the nature of our politics. The greatest transformation has been in the presidency. The president has come to exercise vast power over American economic, social, and personal life, and to exercise that power unabashedly for partisan purposes. He's not just the chief executive of the executive branch and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He is now the nation's legislator-in-chief, lawgiver-in-chief. This role, exercised in an increasingly partisan manner, has led him to forfeit his traditional, irreplaceable function as head of state and national leader. This is a constitutional transformation. Most of those that we faced, such as the post-Civil War civil rights amendments, the Supreme Court's acquiescence in the New Deal, we knew that we were about to make a big change. These changes were widely debated among intellectuals, among politicians. They were big national issues. The change that I've just described has never really been debated as a political issue, and that is because it came slowly, insensibly, on cat's feet over a very long period of time. We're going to be talking about the future of the executive state, but since I'm going first, and this is the Heritage Foundation, and we care about heritage, I'm going to talk a little bit about the past of the current executive state. It began in the early 1970s when Congress began delegating very broad rulemaking powers to a new set of agencies, such as EPA, OSHA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Unlike the New Deal agencies, these new ones issued sweeping nationwide rules costing hundreds of millions of dollars. When agencies began to issue these rules, presidents started to notice that they were getting the praise or blame, usually both, for policies where they hadn't even been in the loop. That wasn't going to last. The 1970s presidents, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, all began requiring agencies to submit major rules to the White House before they were issued, and there were lots of controversies within administrations for the first time over those rules. President Reagan then established a formal procedure for White House regulatory review under a cost-benefit standard, a program that I administered during Reagan's first term and that Paul administered during the Trump administration. White House review in all of these cases was a constraint. The idea was that regulatory agencies like spending agencies would go too far in pursuing legitimate purposes that Congress had given them. In the case of a spending program, we have the budget. There's a budgetary constraint. But in regulatory programs, you're basically spending private money simply by ordering people to do things, and the cost-benefit standard was conceived of as a budget-like constraint on regulatory decision-making. That changed during the Bill Clinton administration, when the White House began to direct agencies to regulate more rather than less, and to pursue initiatives that hadn't occurred to them that were the president's own initiative. For example, President Clinton instructed the Food and Drug Administration to restrict cigarette smoking among teenagers. They didn't remotely have the legislative authority. They didn't want to get involved in it, but they issued it. They issued this rule. President Bush 42, during the financial crisis at the close of his administration, used equally implausible statutory glosses to arrange shotgun mergers between different financial firms, to bail out automobile companies. They said, well, automobiles manufacturing involves finance, so we're going to call these finance companies. And that was actually the statutory interpretation that they said gave them permission to bail out Chrysler and General Motors. Subsequent presidents have taken important further steps. One is issuing unilateral policies in place of initiatives that either rejected or simply failed in the Congress. That's one. Another is to issue policies that important constituencies of the president's party are in favor of, but that members of the president's party in Congress do not want to vote on that issue. Okay? Examples are in the Obama administration, following in his first term, when in his first couple of years, when the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate, Obama had a pretty good legislative record, but two of his priorities, climate change cap and trade program and immigration reform, failed, and he announced, where Congress won't act, I will. And he issued the Clean Power Plan and the DARPA, the different immigration control plans that accomplished what he wanted to in Congress, but without any of the compromises or kind of adopting some of the policies of the other side that you get in regular legislation. So these were pure partisan programs. He also issued the first rules generally requiring schools and localities to let to say that people can use restrooms according to the gender that they feel is their real gender. That was not because Congress was gridlocked on the subject. It would have gotten very low votes in the Congress, but they issued this as guidance. The Trump administration was something of an interregnum, although after the Las Vegas massacre that was committed with a bump stock attached to a semi-automatic, there was a lot of sentiment that bump stocks ought to be banned. The Republicans did not want to vote on that in the Congress. And so with some reluctance, I believe President Trump, stretching the statute quite a bit, banned bump stocks. The Supreme Court recently said that was excessive. Things have gone much further during the Biden administration. The cancellation of nearly $500 billion in student loans is a famous step, but there are dozens and dozens of steps throughout the administration. And the important thing is that we now have all-of-government approaches to problems. When you have an all-of-government approach, what that means is agencies that have statutory missions aren't pursuing those missions. They're pursuing my mission. So now we have the SEC and the Federal Reserve Board are in the pollution control, climate change business. And the Food and Drug Administration and the Comptroller of the Currency are in the equity for racial minorities business. You don't find these charters in their mission statements, but they are pursuing them. This is a big change in the nature of our law when a single individual is the lawmaker for the entire nation. It's a big departure from what we're used to, which is that laws are forged by legislative give and take, compromise among different interests, regions, values. Usually you have to have a very broad consensus to get something through the Congress. Now, if you win the presidency for 4 years, you can enact national laws that would never get through the Congress, but will satisfy one or another constituency group. This is a very, very big change. It's a departure from the traditional rule of law in another sense, in that the law has become much, much less stable. Now, when a new party, a new administration of a new party takes over, we have radical changes, including many outright reversals, such as in the Obama, Trump, and Biden years, fervent back and forth rewritings of national environmental, financial, immigration, charter school, civil rights, sexual relations laws. When the law shifts that radically in very short periods of time, it loses its durability. The law becomes unstable. This discourages voluntary compliance, economic investment, forward thinking of all kinds, much more wasteful spending on lobbying, cultivating inside relationships in Washington. Most of all, it invites justified public cynicism about the subservience of the law to political and executive will. I want to focus in closing on something that will be on many people's minds. But how about the one-loss record? A lot of these things you mentioned, the Supreme Court, they overturned Trump's bumper stock rule. They overturned Clinton's anti-smoking rule. And the presidents have lost a lot of these things. The dynamic when regulations are made at the White House is very different from when they are made at agencies. Agencies have statutory missions, and they sometimes bend the law, go too far in pursuing their statutory missions. But the White House, it doesn't have a statutory mission. The mission is the president's mission. The president wants to do something, and what the White Houses have found out is that in this enormous volume of law, the United States Code, you can find a provision somewhere, you can find a sentence or a phrase that will justify doing just about anything with enough creative interpretation. You're going to have a worse win record in federal courts in this new world, and we've seen some of that. Some of them have gotten through, some of that has not. But I talked about the dynamism of executive government. Take, for example, the immigration policies in the Biden and Obama years. They're basically based upon massive non-enforcement. Non-enforcement is a very hard problem for courts, because if you step in and you tell the executive branch, well, you have to enforce this law this way, that way, that itself is a constitutional trespass. Discretion in enforcement, that is a central task of the executive. And when it stops practicing it, the courts are pretty much helpless. The student loan case, President Biden lost in court. He immediately said, that was a lawless decision, I'm going to get around it. And he's worked again and again and again with all sorts of different ways to chip away at that $430 billion of released loans. And let me tell you something. If you're a creditor and you want to let your debtors not pay you back, they will help. It's really easy to figure out ways not to get paid, and they are figuring that out. A big step in my view was when President Biden issued his order to continue prohibiting evictions from apartment buildings where people hadn't paid their rent, which was in the statute, one of the COVID statute. He says, I'm doing it by myself. And he said, when this gets to court, they're going to say I can't do it. But they're not going to be able to make a decision for a couple months. So everybody can stay in their homes. The president stay in their homes until the courts get around to saying that this is illegal. The president's supposed to be enforcing the law, but here he is working his way around the law. We'll talk about the future. I think that an important reform initiative should be that presidents should refer major national policy questions to Congress and ask them to vote on it, even when he has the authority. I think that the president, if you look through this, he can ban the internal combustion engine. He won't say that he's doing it, but everybody knows what he's doing. He can ban natural gas stoves. He'll say he's not doing it, but if we're actually going to ban isn't that something that Congress should vote on? If we're going to open locker rooms to young teenage boys who say that they feel that they're a girl, that's a pretty big social change. Isn't that something that Congress should vote on? Whether the president has the authority or not, I think that big issues like that have to get back to the Congress, and we have to get back to the traditional methods of give and take consensual lawmaking. Thank you, Giancarlo.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chris. Paul, Chris mentioned at the beginning that the president is now our lawmaker in chief. Can you sort of explore the dynamic, how the presidency itself has been sort of shaped by this change?
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. So my brief opening remarks will basically are a meditation on that line from Chris's, and that should come as no surprise. Some of you have heard the phrase that all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. Well, in some ways, all of thinking on the right about administration is a series of footnotes to Chris's work. So it's a really honor to be up here with you, Chris, and Jen and Steve as well. Quite a distinguished panel. So I want to begin with a proposition that I think is pretty uncontroversial today, and that's that agencies enjoy broad discretion to shape policy, even after Loper-Bright. Originally, there was this Wilsonian vision of administration that imagined that agencies were technical bodies. They could engineer the most effective means to pursue policy goals laid down by the political branches. But as everyone knows, that's not the reality, at least not today. Agencies regularly choose among competing first-order policy priorities, resolving many of our day's most pressing questions. Agencies exercise these broad powers subject to presidential influence. This influence operates through three interlocking mechanisms: the appointment of personnel loyal to the presidential vision, the issuance of executive orders and other directive instruments, and in the case of non-independent agencies, the use of a wire review. Presidential influence over rulemaking is, of course, far from total. Nevertheless, presidents can usually get their top priorities embodied in regulations. Confidence in this ability is, of course, why presidents talk about their regulatory ambitions so often and loudly. They make a show of directing agencies to do this or that because they're confident the agencies will obey. And presidents are powerfully incentivized to make aggressive use of their regulatory powers. People hold the president responsible for just about everything that happens on his watch. That's nothing new. There's a fascinating study showing that Woodrow Wilson was held electorally accountable for shark attacks off the coast of New Jersey in one of his presidential campaigns. But I think it's safe to say things have gotten worse. Presidents get held to account for basically everything these days, and they're also expected to show a kind of energy and activism that we could describe as leadership. To do that, they have to wring just about every last drop of power from the agencies subject to their influence in one way or another. So when presidents use agencies' broad powers to make the kind of dramatic economic or social change their supporters demand, they really do just the sort of thing we would expect Congress to do. They exercise functionally legislative power over the questions subject to agency action. Now, the main point that I want to make today is that this power is shot through with a potential for factionalism that's very similar to what Madison worried about in Federalist 10. Now, I should say at the beginning that I do agree with the point made by Steve Calabresi and a number of other authors in the last decades that the president, because he's accountable to a nationwide electorate, can check congressional factions. He's also well suited to check special interests that may otherwise capture agencies and to check agencies' myopic focus on their own specialized missions. But if presidents can check some factions, they can create others. To see why, we need to realize that the founders relied on plurality to prevent factionalism. You all know the theory laid out in Federalist 10 and 51, that in an extended republic like the United States was at the founding and would become more so throughout history, that there would be too many interest and opinion groups to coalesce around anything but that which was good for the country as a whole and around legislative outcomes that were consistent with our national view about what was fair, about justice. As Madison put it in Federalist 51, legislators would come together around justice and a sense of the public good. That anti-faction mechanism works only if there's two kinds of plurality in the body politic. One, of course, is plurality among interest and opinion groups, but second is plurality among legislators. If all interest and opinion groups were represented by just a tiny handful of legislators, then those legislators would presumably be able to figure out a combination of majority factions to take advantage of minority factions, right? The key is to prevent a number of factions coming together to forge a majority faction coalition. In other words, the Article 1 anti-faction protection operates by means of creating high transaction costs for creating legislative deals. Now, for that reason, the very unity the founders knew to be virtue in an executive is vice in a legislature. because it radically lowers transaction costs and thus enables easy coordination among factions. Because the president sits atop many agencies whose powers touch nearly every aspect of American life, he finds it much easier to put together a package of measures that can advantage an electoral majority at minority expense, and he can do that much more easily than Congress can. Now, some of these factional measures appeal to regular old material self-interest, such as was front and center of Madison's focus in Federalist 10. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Kreiner and Reeves on this point. They've shown pretty compellingly that presidents, just like congressmen, sometimes seek to channel material benefits to the places they think they would do the most electoral good. We should all be shocked. But we'll underestimate the problem if we consider only interest-based faction. In Federalist 10, Madison mentions factions rooted in religious enthusiasm. We might broaden the point to consider ideological factions more broadly. The problem with ideological factions is not that they want to take stuff from others the way material interest-based factions do, but rather that they're so convinced of the truth of their vision of the world and the justice of their claims that they easily overlook the truth and justice to be found on the other side. While ideological factions are more nobly motivated than interest-based ones, they can do just as much harm to their opponents. And presidential administrations, though often powered by the most idealistic of motives, can be rife with this sort of factionalism. The founders worried that if factionalism infected government, citizens would cease to believe they could expect justice from the laws unless they made the laws. They would therefore find themselves locked in a death struggle for control of the controls of the Death Star. The hysteria around every presidential election is just what the founders would have forecast as the consequence of making the president a single or unitary legislature. Briefly, I want to suggest 3 ways in which the president's legislative function imperils the goods the founders sought from having a single executive. First, the president's policy role distracts him and his advisors from core executive functions. Granted an office with legislative responsibility, much of a president's and his team's attention is inevitably pulled away towards setting policy and away from safeguarding the nation's security, supervising execution of the laws, and other truly executive tasks. Second, in the absence of an effective separation of powers, the executive tasks themselves become polluted by legislative considerations. For instance, the founders hoped for an even-handed enforcement of the laws, but presidents with legislative responsibility are powerfully tempted to enforce the law selectively, as Chris mentioned, relying on policies of enforcement discretion as substitutes for legislative action. And third, as the nation's sole executive, the president must at times direct the whole force of the community. And to do so requires him, as Jefferson put it in a letter from 1810, to unite in himself the confidence of the whole people. Note Jefferson's words, not everyone's agreement with the president's measures, that's impossible, but at least their confidence that he's doing the best he can by everyone, not just by a favored few. No recent president has held anything like the confidence of the whole people, and the presidential policy-setting role, which drags presidents into faction fights, surely is one main reason why. Thank you, and I'll gladly turn the virtual mic over to Giancarlo again.
Steve, Paul talked about in part ideological capture and how these concerns about legislating from the president and from his agencies pollute traditional executive roles. What do you make of that? In your experience, what does that look like on the ground?
Well, yeah, I do want to bring it back down to the ground and talk about what's happening in Washington today. I really do think we are seeing a perversion of our constitutional structure in today's administrative state. And I believe it's attributed to a capture of the levers of power of the government by what I would call progressive elites. Why do I say progressive? Well, progressives tend to want to make transformational change in society for aspirational goals, for ideological or idealistic reasons. And why do I say elite? Well, the people making these decisions in the executive branch of the government, the executive branch of a state government like California, are not elected popularly by the people. They are selected for their attributes by a chief executive or appointed by other appointees. And the ideas and proposals they put forward are very elite in the sense that there's very little chance, I believe no chance, that a popularly elected legislature would approve many of these policies or these transformational changes that the agencies are putting in place through their administrative power. It's not necessarily an abuse of executive power. What is executive power? I mean, I've worked in OLC, so has Jen. We've defended executive power. Well, under our constitutional structure, the power of the executive is, number one, to honor and faithfully execute the national policies that Congress has enacted through legislation. Or in the area of foreign affairs and national security, the president does have a wider compass to act unilaterally. But we're not talking about that kind of executive power. We're talking about, as Chris and Paul elegantly described, the creation, the formation of national policy through an administrative agency. And these agencies are exercising power under statutes, in many cases, almost every case, originally enacted decades ago. Often in the 1970s, the Clean Air Act, 1970, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, 1975, talking about the National Gas Act, the Federal Power Act, and they are using these old-time authorities that were enacted for very different purposes to address new problems that the progressive elites view as, in some cases, as they may call them, existential threats, or necessary policy challenges that must be faced. And the two examples I want to focus on, Chris mentioned each, but one is the existential threat posed by climate change. And under the guise of addressing that threat, agencies in the executive branch are using these old statutes, repurposing them to address regulation of carbon dioxide emissions. And that's a transformational change right there, because when you talk about carbon dioxide emissions, any productive activity that humans engage in produces carbon dioxide emissions. And under the theory, the emission of one molecule anywhere in the world has the same effect as the emission of any other molecule. So right there, you're talking about the potential for the EPA and other executive branch agencies to regulate just about every aspect of human life and activity, from the ground to the sky. Absolutely everything. Almost nothing would be beyond the power of the executive branch to regulate and to force change. And so they are using decades-old statutes to attempt to force or coerce transformational changes that will have enormous impacts on everyday Americans, change our entire economy, the power sector, the transportation sectors, other sectors. They are also giving the green light to California to do it through narrow exceptions in the Clean Air Act, and they're driving a locomotive through those exceptions, and the regulators in California, the California Air Resources Board, are using that narrow green light authority from the EPA to enact massive transformational mandates to end the use of internal combustion engine vehicles in all transportation sectors in California, for example. And the impact on the average American is really going to undermine the quality of life. In America, the potential for the American dream. Exactly the kind of national transformational policy decision that, as Chris and Paul described, must be made under our constitutional system by the elected representatives in Congress. The other example is the immigration laws, where the executive branch is simply outright violating the requirements of the immigration laws they are sworn to enforce and honor, or simply not enforcing them, in some cases actually violating them, to pursue, again, a progressive elite policy of open doors on our borders to allow unrestricted immigration into the U.S. through the creation of new kinds of immigration channels that Congress has never voted on and never approved. And so it is fundamentally anti-democratic because it is a workaround of the popularly elected legislature and the democratic process of electing the legislature and creating national policy through the democratic channel. And it is tyranny because it is changing the fundamentals of life for every American without anybody having a chance to vote for it or approve these policies. There's discussion about them to a very limited extent. I think we can all express our frustration about the very limited extent that these policy issues get discussed even at the presidential campaign level. But it goes so far beyond what can be addressed simply through a change of administration. It has become so ingrained in the executive branch. Part of the problem is the executive branch for 40 years has learned to take advantage and exploit the discretion given under the Chevron deference doctrine for the courts in reviewing these administrative enactments, these administrative regulations, so that the agencies take advantage of that and try to press the bounds of that. But also the rise of issues like climate change has just accelerated this. So we've reached a new cresting of the abuses of the administrative state. So what is the potential for future reining in of this problem? Well, all three branches can do their part. As has been described, the Supreme Court is addressing some of the issues through a change in doctrine. So they've gotten rid of Chevron deference. That will, over time, I think, cause a bit of a modulating of this problem because agencies will not be able to go to the furthest extreme in terms of their interpretations of statutory language, and the courts will be the final decider of what the right interpretation is, and that will be fixed as a precedent over time. Also, the court has developed the major questions doctrine. On some issues where the court has identified the issues as having a transformational impact on the economy for the nation, for example, the court will require a very clear statement in language from Congress that it intended to delegate that authority to the agencies. And that will be a check in certain areas, I think, like the EV mandate type regulations, the power plan that was struck down under the Obama administration. But the solution of court decisions is, as has been described, it takes time. It's a delayed protective restraint. It's also uncertain, and it can be ad hoc. So the executive branch obviously needs to reform itself. I will say, to give a call out to Project 2025, a lot of the policies proposed in Project 2025, which maybe have been described as radical, are actually radical in the sense that they are efforts to very significantly restrain the power of the executive branch and bring it back into alignment with the constitutional structure the founders had in mind. And so it seems radical in relation to what's happening right now in the administrative state. But the executive branch can go very far in terms of controlling itself, putting in place reforms on its own rulemaking process, requiring greater transparency, higher quality information, more public input for costlier rules, and as Chris suggests, being frank about the limits of power under existing statutes and going to Congress and asking for more power where there seems to be a national challenge that requires some new regulatory initiative. But we see there is a tendency, as Paul described, for presidents to want to use the full extent of any power they think they may have or courts may allow them to exercise to affect national policy, and that's what presidents seem to represent now in the structure of our government. So therefore, the ultimate solution has to lie with Congress and with the voters. The voters get sufficiently frustrated, and as electricity rates go up and the availability of electricity gets limited and you can't buy the kind of car you want for your family and you need or you can't afford it, there will be a political reaction. And it will be felt first, I think, in Congress. And what Congress can do is take back some of its power. And the best way to do that is a statute which has been around a while. It's been kicking around. People sort of are pessimistic about its chances of ever getting traction, but that's the REINS Act. And what the REINS Act would do is make a fundamental structural change, and it would say when any agency of the executive branch promulgates a rule that will have major impacts economically, that rule may not go into effect until both houses of Congress review it and approve it in a law that gets signed by the president. So basically, Congress has to approve by legislation any major rule that an agency proposes. That fix right there, if put in place, would return us very significantly, I think, back toward the original structure of our constitutional government.
Jen, one of the common refrains, particularly on the left, is, all right, we'll admit the government structure has changed dramatically. The president is immensely powerful. We don't like that half of the time. The solution is independence. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm happy. I think that question will come up in the course of my comments, but I first want to point out, so we've had a rainy couple of days here in Washington, and I don't know that we've been able to really bring the cheer and the sunshine up here, and I want to get to an earlier question you had about can we put Pandora back in the box, and I'm going to have to be consistent, I guess, with the folks up here and make the story even worse, which is I think the answer is resoundingly no, because, I mean, we're talking a lot today about the structure between the president, Congress, and the courts. And I would submit that, unfortunately, like, there's just way too much power at the federal level in general. With decades ago, the expansive understanding of the Commerce Clause, and it's not, and so states should be seen as more of a solution, but beyond that, really, the people and the private sector and the economy and family institutions, and everybody, of course, up here on stage agrees with that. But I think the point is, because we've lost that balance and the federal government has too much, all of the things that we're talking about today ultimately are just the second best. If the constitutional order is not built to handle all of these decisions being made at the federal level, and essentially this view that the federal government can regulate anything, which it emphatically wasn't, you not only had a more constrained understanding of the Commerce Clause at the beginning, but like time and time again, when you look at the Constitution, all these structures put in place to block up federal action and make it challenging, because the founders didn't really want the federal government issuing national solutions for lives that readily. The fact that that's all now kind of blown past means that none of these other mechanisms balancing power between the branches are ever going to adequately work. So we just have to figure out what to do to keep it from being as terrible as it otherwise might be. But that's as hopeful as that's as hopeful as I can get. And just to illustrate the point, before I do have one other idea that hasn't been talked about, but to build on Chris's point about all of the proposals of the Biden administration and even some administrations before then that are forward-leaning with broad statutory authority. You know, there are thousands of lawyers in the executive branch whose job is really just to legitimize and come up with all these creative solutions that you're talking about beyond the president. Just thousands and thousands of lawyers, the best lawyers sometimes in the country, go in and they're thinking about how to maximize power under statutes. And then also the federal government has an enormous capacity to defend in the courts the substance of these actions. But like, if you think about going inside at DOJ and work there, and I don't know if Steve had this experience when he was there, but you know, the government lawyers, even when the action is challenged by somebody in court, it often doesn't even get to the substance before the judiciary, because there are just thousands of government lawyers coming up with jurisdictional defenses to keep the courts from being able to review what the executive branch does. And then if I can make the story worse, and maybe this is an overstatement, but I actually think in a really tragic way we're seeing it play out, when things get to the courts, they have so much pressure, particularly the Supreme Court, 9 justices, to decide all of these ultimate questions of national import, like student loans, affirmative action, abortion, all of these things that over the years we've turned to them to do, and they're trying now to return it to the people. But when they issue these decisions, then now in real time, we're seeing repeatedly like protests, threats of violence, leaks, confidentiality, because the courts are trying to handle more than they can bear. And then if that's not enough, then folks who are upset about action at the federal stage. Now we also have this aberration of thinking, can we criminally prosecute presidents? So I just think there's all this evidence suggesting that the federal level has too much pressure, more than it can bear, and we kind of need to take a pause, and I'm not optimistic that a lot of the institutions are going to readily be able to come back in. So we have to figure out what we can do best to act with integrity, I think, and patience, and hope, and just respect for each other within this system that is deeply flawed and strayed from what it's supposed to be. And I don't. So I'm glad that the court has turned back Chevron deference. I'm not up, and some of these other changes are being made, but I think it's going to take time and just consistency with everybody actually, even voluntarily, sometimes restraining power at the federal level. Is that too negative? We're supposed. I mean, but I can. So one thing we haven't talked about. I mean, Paul and Chris and Steve are all right about agencies and the president and looking like lawmaking. But I think, ironically, as Congress has delegated more power to the executive branch, it hasn't actually empowered the president. What it's done is cause all of these other, again, like aberrant doctrines to crop up, like this idea that, like you said, we need to have independence, we need to have due process rights, we need to have separation between the president and his agencies, because the executive branch has so much power, we don't want the president to be able to fully command it. And so really what you have is not the president as lawmaker, but he's kind of sitting as this sort of weak, disengaged figure, like in a theoretical sense, at the top of this structure that has all of these agencies independently trying to exercise and operate power. And that ultimately what it's doing is it's empowering this kind of extra set of entities that don't have a clear place in the constitutional structure other than being subordinate to the president, and maybe not allowing the president often to be as powerful but also be held as accountable. So it's like a double-edged sword. And I think part of the answer is to look at actually a little bit more of the accountability structure within the executive branch and go back to a more vigorous understanding of executive supervision, the appointments clause, the take care duty of the president to be able to keep the executive branch moving in a certain direction, to have the power to command agencies to do things, that we should have a broader understanding of who's an officer of the United States and an official that needs to be appointed by the president, because it will seem in the short term to empower the president more, but ultimately the more role that the president has in staffing the offices and the positions that serve him, and in having responsibility for firing folks if they need to be fired. And quite frankly, the Biden administration did this in a fairly forward-leaning way. They kind of, without telling anybody this is what they were doing, took the more sort of conservative jurisprudential approach and looked for every position that they could fire, like the general counsel in the NLRB, the Social Security Commissioner, people who sat on, Roger Severino, on like commissions, and they just cleaned house and they got rid of them. And a Republican president could come in and do that, but I think we normally think we're going to face political consequences for it. But we should just command to the fullest extent, and also not give in to the fiction of independent agencies, like be scared to call the FTC commissioners or the SEC commissioners, but like act consistent with the constitutional structure. And it will in the short term seem like it's empowering an already powerful executive, but it will also require there to be accountability. It's like Congress doesn't want to take accountability by trying to delegate power to the executive. We haven't permitted or required presidents to take accountability by allowing them to rely sometimes, and I think this happens more in Democrat administrations, that's maybe my own bias, but allow them to run around and act independently, and then the president can sort of absolve themselves of responsibility when it doesn't work out well or when it's politically unpopular, and that there needs to be a lot tighter control. And then just one final point. So I think Chris was laughing because I like to talk about the appointments clause and have like a long study back from 2018 in the Stanford Law Review that suggests that the original understanding of the appointments clause would have virtually everybody carrying out federal responsibility be considered an officer of the United States, which honestly at the time I was writing it, I think the audience that I was writing to and even myself thought of that as an incredibly executive or presidentially empowering thing, which again in the short term it is, but over the years, as I've continued writing about executive power and constitutional structure, I actually think, ironically, the broader view you have of officers of the United States within our system, the more power it really gives to Congress in a sense as well, because the original understanding of the executive power would have had the president or the king before him supervising everyone, filling every office, creating every office, and Congress actually has an enormous amount of power if it chooses to exercise it. If government officials or officers of the United States, their positions have to be established by law. Congress has to take responsibility. Congress has to say which positions are going to exist. You can't just be creating them by executive order. We have to think through supervision. It could really constrain offices like the Office of Special Counsel. And I think, again, even though it's one of those things that initially sounds like it's going to empower a monarch, really gives more political accountability and power back to the people. So my pitch would be that we shouldn't forget too readily about executive supervision and the appointments clause, and also that even if we can't immediately reverse society's and Congress's broad view of the Commerce Clause, that we at least kind of take it into account and consider ways in which the states and the American people themselves and economic freedom can be empowered, and the federal government maybe play more of a shrinking role.
Chris, what do you make of that? You were writing furiously. You must have thoughts.
Let me just add something to Jen's very interesting remarks. It's important to recognize that this ascendancy of the president to being national lawmaker, this wasn't primarily a seizure of power. This was an abdication by Congress. And I agree with Jen, it is because they were overloaded. The changes in the economy and technology in the post-World War II era, suddenly there were more and more demands on the federal government that it had actually had the power, according to the Supreme Court, going back to the 30s, but nobody was complaining about the environment, back in the 1930s. Smokestacks were a good thing. Now it was a bad thing. We needed new agencies of one kind or another, and the Congress is simply not equipped to make legislative decisions on the hundreds and hundreds of issues that were just cascading in. So what they decided was, we'll take a policy area and we'll create an agency and we'll let them make the decisions. And so the problems we're dealing with are really derivative of the federal government's basically having the power to do everything, and there are interest groups who will want these matters decided at the national rather than local levels, and the concentration of power in the executive is part of that. And I do think that the president has been, you have to be careful about this, because presidents have, in particular circumstances, seized on the powers they've had. They've actually somewhat kind of exalted in it. I love the new executive order press conference, a signing ceremony was for legislation. And the president was sitting here and he was surrounded by the legislators who had made this thing the law. And you always had a couple people from the opposing party. You had a couple private citizens, and pens were handed around. Now the president, he's signing a document. He's surrounded by just his own appointees. He's signing a document that they wrote, giving them instructions. Isn't that a little strange? And then he passes around pens, and some of them are rulemaking orders. Some of them are, you could have done it in a phone call. And it's just, they're just kind of exulting, I can sign this, I can make this law. But I think that the presidents are actually victims of this. I think that it's not just that we've been hurt. I think that the presidency as an office has been hurt because it has become an instrument for partisan, in some cases, highly ideological causes that are part of the president's political coalition. Presidents have been balancing their constitutional responsibilities with their need to hold a coalition together since Thomas Jefferson. So it's been, but until recently, they didn't have the power to punish and reward groups with the immediacy and the particularity. And they're doing that, and Congress actually likes the president doing that rather than they're making the decisions. But I think it's destroying the presidency. The presidents are very quickly becoming reviled, loathed characters. And I think as long as presidents behave the way we've seen, especially in the past few years, that's going to be the case. I absolutely love Jen's idea of taking her Stanford article from several years ago and turning this into, and this is what the president should be doing, rather than posing as this grand national lawgiver. You know, he actually has got a lot of important responsibilities. Why doesn't he turn to those things?
Steve and Paul, you.
Well, yeah, so yeah, I think a really important point to see here is that, well, it's funny, when we think about someone receiving more power or annexing authorities, it's easy to think that that makes that constitutional actor stronger, right? But I don't think it's always so. We talked a little bit about ways in which presidents might be weaker now than they used to be. I want to offer another example of a way in which I think that occurs. When presidents have very limited policy-setting power, they have to go to Congress to get Congress's blessing on their policy proposals, right? President's elected, promising to do something about X or Y issue, and then he has to negotiate with the leaders of Congress to get a solution. The benefit of that, of course, is that that solution then will stand for the foreseeable future, right? It won't be all that the president and his supporters would have wanted, but it does have the great virtue of permanence. When the president can set policy, he can also change policy, obviously. And so what you see today is that, as mentioned, presidents' number one priority in a lot of ways, as soon as they take office, is to reverse all the most important measures of the predecessor. They can't do it completely. There are some measures that are kind of baked in by circumstances. But insofar as they can, they want to reverse all the things that the last guy did, right? It's a way they show competence and zeal. And what that means is that presidents can set a great deal of policy over the course of 4 or 8 years, but they have a great deal of trouble setting policy for the long term. And in fact, they have trouble making their mark in history, which we might think is one of the great things a president might want to do. So yeah, so I just say, you know, it's sometimes to be strong, a constitutional officer has to be constrained. Sometimes having a great deal of power means having a very little bit of strength. And so I think that's a theme we should watch for in discourse about the presidency.
Steve, did you want to weigh in on this topic?
Yes, well, Jen's comments made me think, well, maybe what the solution is to call a constitutional convention. If you really want to return to the original vision of a limited federal government. But in terms of Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, I don't see that going backwards. If you think that a molecule of carbon dioxide emitted anywhere has a global effect, and that's an existential threat to our way of life and the future of humanity, well, Congress is going to have the authority under the Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate that molecule of carbon dioxide. If anything can be purchased commercially over the internet, including your local groceries, that communication travels nationally over the internet and in theory could be regulated by Congress under the interstate commerce power. And so the potential power of Congress today under those realities is enormous. And I don't see it reverting anytime soon. The issue, though, is what is the authority of the executive branch and unelected bureaucrats in the regulatory agencies? Even if Congress has the authority to grant them some broad regulatory compass, what is their authority to make new national policy to address new issues in the absence of a clear decision by Congress, a vote from Congress? And that's where I think we can address fundamental change, and we can realize the goal of realigning the branches. But it can't happen without Congress reforming itself, I think, ultimately, and a structural change in the way Congress approaches its business. And ultimately, I guess the positive thing I would say is the voters can make that happen. The citizens of America can make that happen by reacting to the overreach of the regulatory state. And I see that beginning to happen. I see it beginning to happen when voters turn out of office these rogue prosecutors. When the voters in California, I don't think, are going to abide for long the energy poverty that the policies in California are bringing about. And so I do think the reaction through the democratic channels will, I think, force reform in Congress. That's my optimistic view.
Congress has, as several of you said, been so long very happy with this arrangement for a variety of reasons. On the one hand, you might say there seems to be very little evidence that Congress will suddenly become unhappy with it and change it. On the other hand, though, with the exception of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, we really haven't seen the sort of delegations we saw in the 70s anymore. What do you make of that? Do you think there will be an appetite in Congress? How might it be fostered?
Well, I mean, I just want to first, take issue with the point about delegation. I mean, the Homeland Security Act, and it was understandable, right? We had a real emergent, but I mean, there have been like massive recent increases in government with Congress and empowering, and then all the pandemic statutes. I mean, you could be encouraged. Congress definitely has the power to legislate, but I certainly think Congress, when it has legislated, has often taken more power, even recently. And just going back to the earlier discussion, I think the main overarching point is just if we recognize that ideally the constitutional structure we have was built for there to be less power, and Steve's point is obviously we have modern changes. We're in a different world now than we were 200 years ago. But we just at least should be aware of it, and then I think also be aware that sometimes there are multiple factors influencing every action, and to kind of take a multi-layered, more sophisticated, dynamic approach to policymaking, which I think ultimately, I mean, again, this is my own bias coming out, but sometimes conservatives who don't see government as the solution to everything are better at doing. Then the progressive thing is like, oh, we have a problem, we have to solve it by issuing a regulation. And there's this idea that we sort of directly take a hammer and hit the nail and the answer's there. And so one example I'm thinking of is Steve is saying, well, Congress is going to have this power, it's going to have to exercise it. The typical answer sometimes has been in the past from the public, well, if we have too much power being exercised and we want to be more free, we need a smaller, more constrained Congress. They shouldn't get pay, they shouldn't have staff. And I think, ironically, one thing that could help if Congress needs to do more is they probably need more staff, and they probably need the budget to actually, have good lawyers, have good policymakers, have good experts. But back to the point about the executive branch having all the resources, it has the resources to regulate. It also has the resources to legally justify what it's doing. And so ironically, the more staff that Congress has, the better situation we might face in the long run, because the policymakers who are elected might be doing more, and the administrative agencies will have at least some muscular institution opposing them to regulate them better. Even if we had, my dream is, I should think there should be a legislative Office of Legal Counsel to be able to help the members of Congress, if they have questions, think about the constitutionality of things and the dynamic between the branches. And just one final little inside baseball point to underscore and give some evidence to support that statement. if you work in the Department of Justice and the Office of Legal Counsel, and I assume they did this when Steve was there too, Congress will often ping to DOJ questions about whether a particular policy proposal is constitutional or has problems. And, you know, a lot of times the executive branch has a conflict of interest in answering those questions. So I think Congress needs to be more empowered to do some of this analysis and thinking within its own walls. And for that, it's going to have many more resources, more space, and I don't know if that anybody would ever have a will to do that.
Members?
I don't know if more members is going to help, because then there just has to be agreement. Do you think so? Then they just have to be agreement among a bigger body. Wouldn't that make it worse? I don't know. I'm going to chat. Okay, now everybody's looking at me. Should I keep talking or record?
No. Let me open it. I didn't realize we're almost out of time, so let me open that last point to the three of you, and then we'll turn to some audience questions. All right, well, let's turn to some audience questions. One admonition is that please keep your question to a question and keep it short. Roger. And mics will be coming around for the benefit of people online.
So, as a former unelected bureaucrat, nation's HIPAA regulator, so it was tremendous power. Congress absolutely abdicated its authority. My authority as a regulator was essentially two sentences. Healthcare providers and insurers, et cetera, must provide reasonable and appropriate safeguards to privacy. That was my mandate, to make sure that that was reasonable and appropriate. And that was tremendous power. So when it came to COVID, I decided we're not going to enforce it against people who are using their iPhones to do telemedicine, because it wasn't HIPAA compliant. And that revolutionized. That was a national policy decision during that emergency, and I think it saved lives. Based on that broad delegation from Congress, they're not going to revisit that statute. And now the current administration has used that same authority to go after whistleblowers that have blown the whistle on transgender abuses in hospitals, and saying you cannot cooperate with law enforcement in pro-life states to report on abortion violations. Right? So that same broad authority is open to rampant abuse. I don't see Congress going back to HIPAA. We have Loper-Bright that says it's the best reading of the law. What's the best reading of the law of reasonable and appropriate if Congress is not going to stop doing this dereliction of duty?
Yeah, so, no, Roger, it's a great point. So obviously there's a lot of interest in Loper-Bright these days, and I want to say, I think it's a really big improvement to our administrative law that Chevron deference is no longer the law of the land. Loper-Bright's a great decision, and we should all be very happy about it. That said, Loper-Bright constrained agency discretion to interpret ambiguous terms. But reasonable and appropriate isn't ambiguous, it's just vague. It's perfectly clear that it's perfectly vague. It's open-ended. There's no content there. So the demise of Chevron doesn't constrain agency power where terms like that are at issue.
The non-delegation doctrine would.
It surely would.
Could, or the arbitrary or capricious review, like State Farm hard look review, but that then pings it to the courts.
So let me follow up on that, because we haven't talked very much about the courts yet. To what extent, if any, can the courts be helpful? To what extent, if any, is further judicial engagement, say with non-delegation, major questions, or even clawing back the Commerce Clause power, only going to set up further disputes between the judiciary and the other two branches?
That will continue to happen. I mean, there will be arguments made. There are members of the current court very sympathetic to a non-delegation, a more robust non-delegation doctrine, and to reconsidering the scope of the commerce power of Congress. I mean, Justice Thomas has expressly said that. So there are receptive ears on the court, and there are a lot of good lawyers making arguments. They'll continue to make those arguments, and there may be a groundbreaking decision some years in the future. I don't see it happening very soon. And so again, it's sort of an example of the ultimate check of the courts is a bit of an uncertain predictor. I mean, it's ad hoc to particular cases, and situations have to align before those issues get clearly presented in the right case to a court to make a sweeping change in the jurisprudence. And it's just, as Jen pointed out, these threshold issues of standing and other jurisprudential doctrines really can hamper the ability to predict when the court's going to get the issues.
I think the court is going to tighten up its non-delegation doctrine. I'm quite certain that when it does so, it is not going to declare the Food and Drug Administration or the Federal Reserve Board unconstitutional. It's not going to put them out of business. The Food and Drug Administration's mandate is safe and effective drugs. That's very close to the statute that Roger was enforcing. And it's not going to say that that's too vague. It just isn't. It would be, the Food and Drug Administration is probably, even after COVID, one of the most highly regarded agencies. And we are going to have a national program of pre-clearance of powerful pharmaceutical drugs. It's going to continue. And Congress is not going to review drugs itself, and it cannot specify much more clearly. So this seems to me the case that Roger gave us is one where with the authorities that the federal government has today and the technology and the society we have, we're going to have statutes like that. The court is not going to prevent Roger or his successors in the Obama administration from making rules that affect telemedicine, abortion, the other issues that he mentioned. So it's a matter of a revived congressional oversight. That's the only answer to it, I think.
Yeah, we also should not be, well, there are many reasons to be skeptical of any claim that the courts will save us all. Here's an additional reason. It's pretty clear that the founders didn't imagine a world in which the president was continually running up against the courts over and over, day in and day out. The president is meant to run up against Congress and vice versa, right? Those are the two political branches. The tension between them is meant to be productive. It can be productive because it's frankly, because both can push back on the other. Courts are not set up to play politics versus Congress or the president. What I think you see that's new in the last couple of decades is agencies issue regulations that are quite appropriately subject to judicial review. With the growth of presidential influence over the rulemaking process, that means that more and more rulemakings will be defended in public, not from the agency, but from the White House. And that sets up a kind of real possibility of frequent fights between the White House and the courts. And I think we should all be pretty concerned about that. The courts are not designed to withstand the kind of popular pressure that a president can bring to bear on them for repeatedly invalidating regulations issued at his direction. I mean, think of the student loan case, right? Within I think a few hours of the Supreme Court's decision in the student loan case, the president had taken to television to explain why the decision was bad for Americans and unlawful, in fact, right? And presidents can do that every time the courts strike down one of their regulations. That's a profoundly troubling development in relations between the branches.
One more quick question here at for the end.
I will use the microphone to see the question out.
For the benefit of people online.
Well, then, since I'm rewatching all of Ted Lasso, I'll have to say Trent Crimm, The Independent. If you don't know what Ted Lasso, you don't get the joke. But so if the nature of the division of power is the cat's out of the bag, we're not going to go back to that. We're not going to go back. Separation of powers. We're not going to be able to get back to that. Then it seems like the only thing left is division of power under federalism. But the last time I cared about being a Michigander is when we played Ohio State. And so it doesn't seem like there is going to be much action on the part of the states in order to be able to push back against state power. So the question is there a market for states to either use interposition or nullification in order to be able to fight over, unconstitutional overreach on the part of the states, the part of the federal government.
Well, it doesn't go all the way to back to Calhoun, but we do have, in the past several years, the new phenomenon of this new federalist division. When a Democratic administration in Washington issues a big rule, 10 or 12 attorney generals of Republican states are going to file suit against it, and they're going to find a district judge someplace who will issue a national, I'm speaking very broadly, injunction. And when a Republican president issues rules, a bunch of Democrats are going to do the same thing. So a lot of the litigation now against new federal regulations, especially of the very extravagant kind that we're talking about, is state legislation coming from states of the opposite party. And I think that there are a lot of problems with that, because you can always find a district court someplace. If every district judge can make law for the entire country, I think that that's a problem. But I'll just say it's an important arena of law today where some of our federalism is showing some of its old stuff.
Well, I see that we are unfortunately out of time. Please join me in thanking the panelists.